My uncle cheated me out of my inheritance, laughing all the way to the bank. He had no idea I control the trust fund. What happens next will leave you speechless. The smell of polished wood and stale paper filled the lawyer's office. I remember the way the sunlight cut through the blinds, striping the table with sharp lines of gold and shadow. My uncle sat across from me, his chair angled slightly back, his legs crossed, one polished boot tapping lazily against the floor. He wore that tired smile, the one I had seen too many times before, half smugness, half false sympathy. But this time, it carried something sharper. It was the smile of a man who believed he had already won. On the table between us lay the stack of papers, their edges crisp, the black ink still looking fresh, as though they had been signed only moments before I walked in. I didn't even need to ask what they were. I could feel it. My father's land, the house I grew up in, the savings that were supposed to carry me into the future. Every last piece had been shifted into my uncle's name. With just a few strokes of a pen, he had stripped me of what was mine. The lawyer cleared his throat, his voice low and practiced, a man caught between duty and discomfort. "Everything is settled now," he muttered, his eyes flicking from me to my uncle as if he wished to avoid them both. His hands were quick as he slid the folder shut and pushed it into the drawer, sealing away the betrayal as though it were nothing more than a file to be archived. The sound of the drawer closing echoed louder than it should have, final and cold. My uncle leaned forward, placing a heavy hand on my shoulder. His fingers squeezed just enough to feel like ownership, not comfort. "You're young," he said, his voice smooth, coated with that false concern that always seemed to drip from his lips. "You don't understand how to manage these things. It's better this way." He looked at me as if I should thank him. His eyes were bright, glinting with something he didn't even try to hide. Triumph. Inside, my chest tightened, but not with shock. No, the shock had already passed the moment I saw those papers. What I felt now was quieter, more dangerous, a fire without flame, heat without smoke. But outside, I showed nothing. My face stayed calm, my lips pressed into a thin line, my eyes steady. I let him believe I was powerless. I let him believe I was the boy he thought he had cornered. As we stepped out of the office, the late afternoon sun struck us both, hot and glaring. My uncle straightened his shoulders, adjusting his jacket as if he carried some new crown. I stayed a step behind him, my silence stretching between us like a rope. He thought it was weakness. He thought it was surrender. But as I walked, my mind drifted unbidden to moments from long ago. I remembered the sound of his laughter in our kitchen, the way he could make my father's chest shake with joy. I remembered sitting at the table as a child, listening to their stories of growing up poor, sharing everything they had, dreaming of more. Back then, I had believed my uncle was family in the truest sense of the word. Yet even then, there had been cracks in the picture. I could still see the night, when I was 12, creeping down the hallway for water and catching his hushed voice in the kitchen. He had been talking about money, about debts, about needing help again. My father had waved it off when I asked about it the next day, smiling that tired smile of his own. "He's always been greedy," my father had said, "but he's harmless." Harmless. The word echoed bitterly now as I watched my uncle's proud gait in the sunlight. My father had been wrong. My uncle wasn't harmless. He was patient. He was cunning. And he had waited until my father's grave was fresh before making his move. I let my gaze linger on him as we reached the sidewalk, noticing the little things, how he adjusted his cufflinks like a man showing off wealth, how he whistled under his breath like someone lightened of a burden. He believed this day was his victory. He thought he had pulled the perfect trick, and in some ways, maybe he had. To everyone else, it would look that way. To the lawyer, to the neighbors, to the men at the bar who would surely hear him brag tonight. But he had overlooked something so simple, so quiet, that he never considered it. He thought I was just the quiet nephew who never questioned him, who never raised his voice, who never demanded more than what was given. That was the mask I let him see, the part of me he had built in his own mind. The truth was very different. My father had trusted him, yes, but my father had trusted me more. The trust fund he created wasn't his to touch. My uncle had no idea that I controlled it, that every document, every key to the true inheritance was locked in my hands, not his. That truth lay between us like a hidden blade, and I kept my fingers curled around the hilt, waiting. I didn't speak as we walked toward his car. I didn't ask him why. I didn't demand explanations or throw accusations. What would be the point? He would lie, and I would know it. Better to stay silent. Better to let him believe he had already won. Because men like him never see the knife until it cuts. He turned to me before opening his car door, his eyes narrowing as though he was searching for gratitude, or maybe submission. "This is for the best," he said again, softer this time, as if trying to convince himself. His hand tapped the roof of the car, a restless rhythm betraying the nerves behind his polished act. I simply nodded, meeting his gaze with a calmness that seemed to satisfy him. Let him think I was broken. Let him think I had nothing left. Because what he didn't know was that this wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. And as I stood there, watching him drive away, a single thought circled in my mind, quiet but unshakable. He didn't know I controlled it, and I wasn't about to tell him. Not yet. After that day in the lawyer's office, I stayed silent. My uncle expected me to lash out, to fight, maybe even to beg, but I gave him nothing. Silence was my shield, and I wore it like armor. Around town, I let him strut, chest puffed out, a man newly crowned. He paraded himself through the streets, as though he had earned his empire rather than stolen it. He made sure every handshake was firmer, every laugh louder, every boast just a little more cutting. I walked in the same spaces as him, but I moved quietly, like a shadow. People pitied me. I could see it in their eyes. Some shook their heads as though I was a lamb stripped of its fleece, left naked in the cold. I didn't bother correcting them. Let them believe I had lost everything. Let them whisper in the corners of bars and shops. Their whispers were a cloak for me. Hiding the truth, I carried like a weapon tucked deep under my coat. It didn't take long for my uncle to show his hand. Greed makes men careless, and he was no exception. He began spending with the energy of a man who believed he was untouchable. I watched him buy a gleaming black truck, chrome shining under the sun, parked it in front of his house like a trophy. He threw parties, nights thick with smoke and laughter, music loud enough to rattle windows down the block. Men came in droves, men he wanted to impress, men who slapped him on the back and drank his whiskey. He fed off their approval, raising glass after glass, boasting about how he was the man in charge now. More than once, I slipped into the same bars he drank in, taking a seat in the back where the shadows kept me hidden. He never noticed me there, too busy holding court with his circle. After a few drinks, his tongue loosened. The boy didn't have the head for it, he would say, voice thick with liquor and pride. I took care of business like his father would have wanted. Smarter, cleaner. His words stirred laughter around him, men nodding, raising their mugs. I let myself smile when I heard these things, though I never smiled for long. It was a smile sharpened by irony, because what he thought he had stolen was nothing compared to what I still held. What he didn't realize was that every word he boasted was another rope tightening around his neck. He believed he had made me a fool, turned me into some boy too timid to defend what was his. He believed he had won, and in that belief, he grew reckless. I took mental notes each time I saw him brag, recording not just his words, but the expressions of the men around him, their nods, their laughter, the witnesses who would one day remember. At night, when the noise of the town settled and I lay alone in the quiet of my room, my thoughts turned to my father. I could almost see him sitting at the kitchen table again, his large hands folded around a cup of coffee, his voice steady. Money will twist a man's soul if he lets it, he had once told me. It doesn't change who he is, it reveals him. I knew then that my father must have seen this truth in his brother long before I had. Perhaps that was why he had crafted the trust the way he did, weaving in clauses, giving me the quiet authority that no one else could touch. He must have known his brother's heart, must have felt the shadow of this betrayal hovering at the edges of the years. Why else would he have given me the keys without ever saying them aloud? That thought became my anchor. It told me that my father had prepared me for this moment long before I knew it. And so, I began my own quiet watch, not simply waiting, but collecting, Piece by piece, I gathered proof. The bank records of his spending, copies of transactions I quietly requested from men willing to talk. A bartender who muttered to me one night, "Your uncle doesn't shut up after his fourth drink," shaking his head with a half-smile. A clerk at the dealership who laughed about how quickly the new truck was paid for in cash, no questions asked. I wrote it all down, careful and neat, in a notebook I kept hidden under my bed. It wasn't evidence I needed for the trust. The trust was already mine, but I wanted to see the full picture of his betrayal. I wanted a mirror so polished that when the time came, I could show him exactly who he was. Sometimes, when I sat with that notebook, pen scratching under the glow of a single lamp, I wondered if my uncle ever sensed it, that the more he flaunted, the more he revealed. Did he ever catch the way my eyes lingered on him, calm and steady, as though I was watching a fire spread across dry grass? Did he notice how I never asked questions, never argued, never begged for scraps? If he did, he ignored it, because men like him only see what flatters them. The weeks stretched into months, and with each one, his arrogance grew. At the bar, I overheard him slamming his hand down on the counter, boasting, "That boy won't last a year on his own. He'll come crawling to me before long." His voice had that hard edge of certainty, the kind that only comes from a man who thinks he has already beaten his enemy into the ground. I sat 3 stools away, nursing a glass of water, the corners of my lips curling in a smile he never saw. But I was patient. I didn't need to fight him then. I didn't need to stand up in that bar, call him a thief, or shout about the truth that burned in my chest. What would it have done? The men around him wouldn't have cared. They would have laughed, clapped him on the back, and called me bitter. No, I knew better. Silence was stronger than shouting. Silence was the trap he couldn't see. Each page of my notebook filled like the ticking of a clock, each detail another step closer to the day the mask would shatter. I could feel it building, the weight of all I carried in secret, like storm clouds rolling heavy above a town that still basked in sunlight. And as I watched my uncle walk through those sunlit streets, proud and blind, I held on to one truth that gave me more strength than anything else. I didn't hurry. I didn't need to. Time was on my side, and the longer he thought he was safe, the harder he would fall. It was on one of those nights when the house sat heavy in silence, broken only by the creak of floorboards and the faint hum of cicadas outside, that I found a missing piece of the puzzle. My uncle sat slouched at the kitchen table, a bottle of whiskey half drained before him, the amber liquid catching the dim light of the single bulb overhead. His hand trembled slightly as he poured another glass, spilling more than he managed to drink. His eyes, bloodshot, swollen, restless, wandered over papers scattered across the table. Bills, loan statements, letters with red stamps of urgency. I watched from the hallway, unseen, my breath shallow as though the air itself could betray me. He thought himself alone, but what I saw in those papers told me more than his slurred tongue ever could. He wasn't just greedy, he was drowning. Years of wagers at tracks, nights spent at smoky card tables, debts scribbled in ledgers owned by men who did not wait patiently for repayment. These had tightened around his neck like a noose. I leaned against the wall, my heart steady in my chest. For years I had wondered why he had taken what was mine so quickly, why he rushed to secure signatures before my boots had even stepped across the threshold. Now I knew. It had not been triumph. It had been desperation. My inheritance hadn't been his prize. It had been his lifeline. I felt a bitter taste rise in my mouth, not from pity, but from memory. A flicker of boyhood came unbidden. My father at the paddock fence, handing over coins after a horse sale, his voice calm and forgiving as he told my uncle, "Don't worry, pay me when you can." And my uncle, always nodding, always promising, never paying. My father had seen the weakness. He had chosen to forgive it, thinking that blood meant more than balance sheets. But I could not forgive. Not this. I could not let that weakness swallow everything my father had worked for. I stepped back into the shadows as my uncle knocked the whiskey bottle over, amber spilling across the letters like a spreading wound. His curses slurred together, half sobs, half growls. He swept the papers to the floor, buried his face in his hands, and for a moment he looked smaller than I had ever seen him. A boy lost in a man's shell. That was the night I knew what had to be done. I did not confront him. I did not storm into the kitchen and demand what was mine. Instead, I returned quietly to my room, where the lamp on my desk cast its pale circle of light over the documents I had been collecting. Bank statements, property deeds, my father's will, which held its secrets in plain sight if one cared to read carefully. I sat down, laid the papers before me, and began to craft the shape of my revenge. Slow, deliberate, like water wearing away stone. I let him spend. I let him drink. I let him believe that by robbing me, he had cheated consequence. All the while, the trust fund sat untouched in my name, swelling with interest like a hidden reservoir. He thought he had stripped me bare, but he had only grasped smoke. The fire, the true inheritance, remained mine, locked away beyond his reach. Weeks turned to months, and I played my part well. When he spoke to me, bragging of the deals he had made, his words laced with the confidence of a man who thought he had won, I nodded. I smiled even, though inside I watched every boast for the cracks forming beneath. One afternoon, he slapped me on the back after returning from town, his laughter booming, a false cheer that smelled of whiskey. "You see, boy," he said, his voice thick, eyes glittering with the desperation of a gambler who had rolled well for once. "Your old uncle knows how to keep things running. You don't need to worry about a thing. Family takes care of family." His hand lingered on my shoulder, heavy, claiming, as though I should thank him for the theft he called protection. I forced a smile. "Of course," I murmured, my voice even. "You always know what you're doing." But behind my calm, I counted the days. When the time was right, I made my move. I walked into the bank on a bright morning when the streets outside were alive with merchants calling out their wares and horses clattering on cobblestones. The manager, a man in a neat suit with spectacles perched low on his nose, greeted me with a warmth he never showed my uncle. He knew where the real authority lay. "Mr. Ellison," he said with a polite nod, "we have your documents ready." I signed what needed signing. The ink flowed smoothly from my pen, binding the land, the investments, the house itself back under my name. No arguments, no hesitation. The law, silent but unyielding, stood with me. I asked that the notices be sent directly to my uncle. I did not want the satisfaction of handing them to him myself. No, I wanted him to feel the ground vanish beneath his own feet. And so it began. The first letter came in a plain envelope, folded with the cold precision of bankers. I watched from the porch as he tore it open, his brow furrowing as he scanned the words. His lips moved silently, trying to decipher the language of foreclosure. He crumpled the paper in his fist, muttering curses under his breath, and tossed it aside as though by discarding it he could erase the truth. But then more arrived. Thick envelopes, some marked urgent in bold red. He opened them with shaking hands, his face paling each time, his jaw clenching tighter. His nights grew restless. I could hear him pacing the floorboards long after midnight, muttering to himself, the shuffle of his boots tracing circles that never led anywhere. One evening, as the sun sank low and painted the sky in bruised shades of purple and orange, I saw him again on the porch. He sat hunched in the rocking chair, a letter dangling from his hand. His eyes scanned the page over and over, as if the meaning might change if he read it enough times. His other hand trembled on the armrest, his knuckles white as though he clung to the chair for balance. He whispered something, a plea perhaps, though the words were too faint for me to catch. His chest rose and fell unevenly, his breath shallow. For the first time, he looked less like a thief and more like a man standing at the edge of a cliff, staring down at the fall he had made for himself. I stood across the yard, silent, watching. My heart did not soften. My father's voice echoed in me, not in forgiveness, but in the memory of all he had built. That work was mine to protect, and no weakness, no drunken debt would take it from me. My uncle raised the letter higher, squinting at the words as though they might rearrange themselves into mercy. But mercy was not coming. His world was collapsing, one envelope at a time. He didn't know how the ground had disappeared beneath him. But I did. I never raised my voice to him. I never told him what I had done. That was the beauty of it. My revenge wasn't loud. It wasn't violent. It was quiet, inevitable like water breaking down stone. The day I first saw the cracks in his mask, it was on Main Street, under the faded awning of a hardware store he used to walk past with his chest puffed out. He was leaning against a lamppost, his arms folded across his chest, but his shoulders slouched in a way I'd never seen before. His shirt was wrinkled, the once bright white now yellowed with sweat. His jaw, usually set with arrogance, hung loose, as if the weight of something unseen dragged it down. He spotted me before I could turn away. His eyes, dull and ringed with exhaustion, flicked to mine. For a brief moment, I thought he might sneer, might throw one of his old taunts, but instead he forced a smile. It didn't fit his face anymore. It was weak, trembling around the corners. "You doing all right?" he asked. His voice carried none of the power it once had. It was thin, worn, almost childlike. I held his gaze and gave a small nod. That was all. No words, no explanation. I didn't know him one. The silence stretched between us like a chasm, and in that silence, I knew he felt it too. Everything he had stolen from me, everything he thought he had won, it was slipping away from him piece by piece. His eyes lingered, searching for something in my face. Maybe pity, maybe forgiveness. He would find neither. With a shallow breath, he pushed himself off the lamppost and shuffled away, his steps slow and heavy, like each one dragged him deeper into the ground. I turned and kept walking, but the image of him stayed with me. The man who once laughed in my face now looking like a shadow of himself. That was my revenge. Not fire, not fists, just time, silence, and inevitability. That evening, I drove to the house. My father's house. The sun had just dipped below the trees, painting the sky in bruised shades of purple and gray. The gravel crunched beneath my tires as I pulled into the driveway, and for the first time in years, I sat there with the engine off, staring at the front door. The paint on the door had peeled, curling like dry bark. The windows were dark, their glass streaked with dust. Yet, despite the neglect, it still stood. It was still mine. The weight of the keys in my pocket pressed against my leg, a constant reminder of what I had reclaimed. Not just the house, but everything it stood for. I got out of the car slowly, my shoes sinking into the gravel. The evening air was cool, brushing against my skin with a faint scent of pine and damp earth. I paused halfway up the path, staring at the porch. Memories came unbidden. My father sitting there, his hands calloused and stained with grease from long days at the shop, his voice steady as he told me stories about work, about life, about the importance of standing tall even when others try to break you. My chest tightened. He hadn't lived to see this day, to see justice served in its quietest form. But I could almost feel him there beside me, watching, nodding with that quiet pride he never put into words. When I reached the door, I pulled the keys from my pocket. They jingled softly, the sound echoing in the stillness of the night. I held them in my palm, staring at the worn metal teeth glinting in the fading light. They didn't feel like ordinary keys. They felt heavier, as though every lie, every betrayal, every moment of silence had been melted down and cast into their shape. I slid the key into the lock. For a moment, my hand hesitated. There was no triumph in me, no urge to shout or declare victory. Instead, there was a deep stillness, like the hush before a storm breaks. This wasn't about winning. It was about balance, about restoring what had been taken. The lock clicked. The door creaked open, its hinges groaning in protest, and the air inside rushed out to meet me. It smelled of dust, of old wood, of time left untouched. I stepped over the threshold and paused, my eyes adjusting to the dim light. The living room stood just as I remembered it, though draped in shadows. The old sofa sagged in the middle, the clock on the wall had stopped, and a thin layer of dust coated everything. Yet beneath that dust, it was still home. I walked further inside, each step stirring the silence. My hand traced the edge of the wooden table, feeling the grooves my father had carved into it absent-mindedly while fixing things late into the night. The walls, the floor, the air itself, it all carried his presence. And then I thought of my uncle, of the way he had sat at this very table years ago, pretending to care, pretending to guide me, all while his eyes gleamed with greed. He had cheated me, convinced me that my father's legacy was gone, that my future was his to dictate. But he had never known the truth. He never realized that the trust fund had been in my hand from the start, that while he laughed and gambled away what he thought was mine, I had been holding the real power all along. His triumph had been nothing more than smoke, and I had let him choke on it until nothing remained. His laughter had turned to silence. His new truck now sat unpaid in the driveway, a monument to his foolish pride. His house was emptier each week, stripped bare by debts and broken promises. I didn't have to lift a hand against him. He had destroyed himself. I sank into the sofa, the springs groaning beneath my weight, and stared at the shadows stretching across the floor. My chest rose and fell slowly, steady. I didn't cheer. I didn't celebrate. There was nothing to celebrate. What had happened wasn't victory. It was justice, shaped not by noise or violence, but by patience and silence. For a long time, I just sat there, listening to the faint ticking of the stop clock, the house breathing around me. My thoughts drifted back to my uncle's face that afternoon, the forced smile, the hollow eyes. That was the face of a man who had gambled everything and lost. And me? I had stepped back into the life my father wanted for me, not through fire or fury, but through quiet resolve. I stood, walked to the door, and looked back one last time. The house was mine again, not just in name, but in truth. The keys weighed in my hand, heavy with meaning. My uncle had cheated me out of my inheritance, but he never realized the truth. I had been the one in control the whole time. In the end, he was left with nothing but the weight of his own greed, while I walked back into the life my father had wanted for me. Revenge didn't need to be loud. Sometimes, the quietest justice is the sharpest kind. Disclaimer: the story you just watched is fictional. It explores powerful themes of betrayal, manipulation, and the dramatic consequences of underestimating someone. This narrative aims to highlight the importance of knowing your own worth and to inspire a deeper appreciation for the quiet power of a long-term plan.